All right, everyone. So, major chunk of what we're going to be talking about today is what is referred to as CSS box model. Okay. So everything we've been kind of talking about over the last two modules really represents kind of the visual aspect of CSS. So things that you can visually see like fonts or colors or background colors. Okay. What we're going to talk about today is less about visuals and more about layout. Okay. So what is layout? Well, you guys may have taken a class in page layout, or maybe you've done, compositional placement in like a drawing or a painting class of some sort. But a layout is sort of saying, okay, this is going to go here, and this is going to go here, and this is going to go here. So for instance, let's say I have an image and I'm saying, okay, I'm going to put an image here, and there's going to be an image in the lower right. And, then there's going to be some text here, and some text here, and some text here, and just for fun, there's a video here. Okay, this would be page layout. Okay, we're saying where things are going to go. All right, so, like I said, visual means like things like colors, imagery. Layout means like how big things are, like in terms of their width, their height, how much spacing there is between things. So if you've had experience with, using something like Adobe InDesign, or maybe using some of the more advanced spacing features of like Microsoft Word or something, that is what we're going to be doing today with talking about box models. So for instance, like, this is visual, which is like spacing and text size and color. What we're going to be doing here is more about like the width of something, the spacing between something, how much space there is between the content and the edge of the container, things like that. Okay. So the idea of box model is that you can take every tag and treat it like a box or a square, okay, hence the term box model. And the idea here is that each box has a top, a right, a bottom, and a left. So it doesn't, it could be something like an H1 tag, or an H1 tag, or an H2 tag, or a section tag, or a div tag, or a header, or a footer, or a main. All of them are going to be a square / rectangle that has a top, a right, a bottom, and a left. All right, so let's take a look at this. I'm going to go back to our exercises here. This is exercise 4. And I just want you to take a look, and before we do anything, notice that I have a couple of, I have a div, I have a section, I have an A side. A section is a collection of something, right? A div is a division or sort of a smaller collection, and an A side is a sidebar. And each of these is getting a background color, okay? Yellow, orange, and gray. Let's take a look at this. All right, so this is how it looks. All right. Now, each of these tags has a default width and height, okay? So when it comes to the width depends on whether the HTML tag is a block tag or an inline tag. Okay, so what I mean by that is, remember we've talked about block tags go typically the width of the page. Inline tags, like a strong tag or an EM tag, the width is basically just the amount of content. So if I go back to this example here, I'm going to add in some text, like an EM tag, or an underline tag, or a strong tag. Okay. So in this case, you know, each of these is the div, the section, and the A side are block tags. Okay. So the way that a block tag works by default is the default width of a block tag is 100% of the parent. So in other words, to figure out what the width of this div tag is, it looks directly at the parent. Now, in this case, the parent of the div tag is actually the body tag. Okay, so this kind of breaks down of like, this is the, you know, if I was to look at the layout here, this is the div, and then this is like the p tag. Or sorry, I made that all wrong. I apologize. This is the body tag, and the div is inside of that. So because the div is a child of the body, whatever size the body is, that's going to be the size of the div. Okay, now by default, the body is really just the web page. So when I preview this, my div tag will be the length of the web page, because in theory that's the width, the, you know, the web page is the body, you know. And the section and the A side are similar in that they are based on, you know, on this, in that it's going to be whatever the size of the body is. Okay. The default width of an inline tag is the width of the content. So what I mean by that is, if I were to give a background color to the EM tag like this, and let's give it a background color of, say, aqua, it's only going to do based on the amount of content that's in that tag. Okay. Notice it's not affecting the entire line because it only affects that particular inline tag. If I make that inline tag longer, then the width gets longer. Okay. So once again, the default width and height is based on whether it's a block tag or an inline tag. In terms of the height, the default height of a block tag is based on the amount of content. So what I mean by that is, this height here, from here to here, is based on the amount of content there is. If there's more content, the height will be more. If there's less content, the height will be less. You can even see this. If I do an inspect, what I'm going to do is actually select this div tag, and when I do that, see how it actually gives, see on that little, I can't move my mouse because otherwise I'll get rid of it, but see how it says 2008 by 98, 2.5? So 1208 is the width in pixels. The height is 92.5 or 92 pixels, 92.5 pixels high. If I take all this content and I just add more by just copying and pasting, and I refresh this bad boy, if I go back, you can see now it's 185. So the height is entirely based on the amount of content. If I were to subtract content like this, and just delete it and save and go back and refresh, you can see my height has dramatically gotten less. Now it's only 74. Okay. The same is similar for a inline tag in that it's based on the amount of content there is. So the more content, if the content keeps going, eventually it would become a second line or adding more height, or otherwise it would stay one line. Okay. Now, why am I telling you that? Well, because part of layout is wanting to set dimensions of things. Okay. So if I'm setting up a page and I'm trying to set up my content, I want to know how big that section is, or I want to know how tall that section. Once again, this is very similar to Adobe InDesign. So I've switched over here to Adobe InDesign really quickly. If you've never taken Adobe InDesign, don't worry. It's you know, you don't. I'm not trying to teach you that. Basically, it's a basic page layout program. It's typically used for like posters or multi-page documents like magazines. But here I have some text. It's in what we call a frame. A frame is holding the text. And this is very similar to the idea of like a tag in HTML, where the tag holds the text. And in fact, you can actually set a background color to this frame in Adobe InDesign, which is a lot kind of like setting the background color to a tag in HTML and CSS. So here I have, if you know, here it's like, well, if I wanted to resize the width and height, there's little free transforms, right? And I can take the height and make it taller or shorter, or I can take the width and make it longer or shorter, right? And so we can do the same thing here. HTML or CSS has something called the width property. So by default, like I said, this here is a block tag. So its default width is the width of its parent. In this case, the parent is the page. So as my page gets bigger and smaller, these block tags will grow or shrink because the page is growing or shrinking. What if I wanted to set an actual width though? So what I could do is I'm going to go here and I can set a width of, say, 500 pixels. Okay. What this means is now this div section is always going to be 500 pixels. It's not going to be less. It's not going to be more. And so you can see now as the page opens and closes, it doesn't resize itself because it's staying that width. In fact, you could actually make the page longer, or sorry, you can make the container longer than the actual width of the page. In this case, my container is actually longer than the amount of content, or the content is wider than the actual page. And because I can't change the width because I've set it, it actually requires that I scroll back and forth. Okay, so you can set a width. You can also set a height. So just like in Adobe InDesign, where it's like I'm coming into here and you know I'm setting a width and I'm setting a height. Well, I can set a width and a height for my tag. So like I said, by default, the height for most tags is just based on the amount of content you have. So it's not going to be taller than that content, and it's not going to be shorter than that content. If I want to make my container bigger, I could use a height, and I'm going to use a taller height than the default. And you can see that even though the content is only about halfway through, I still have this extra area here. Okay, so now if I come into here, when I select this div, you can see where it says 400, 400 there. Okay, so let's try that out. I'm just going to give each of these dimensions. Set a width of 350. Let's preview that. And we give it a height of 275. And let's set this to width height of 350. 350. Okay. So I can set, I can give dimensions to things, right? So that's great because that's kind of the first step into setting layout is giving dimensions so that we can eventually move them. Okay, so it's not just the default width or the default height. It can also lead to issues, and I'm going to show you an example. So here I have this div. This is exercise 5, and I have these paragraphs that are inside of this div. Okay, let's preview the page real quick. Looks like this, and just to help us see what's happening, I'm going to give this div a background color. Let's give it a background color of orange, and let's give it a width and a height. I'm going to set the width to 300 and the height to grade 100, let's say. Okay. And I'm going to go back and let's refresh. So here, this looks like this is my div, right? But then I have all this content that's spilling out. Okay. Now what is exactly happening here? Well, I'll show you. What's happening here is that the content is bigger than the size of your container. Okay. I have an example here. The way I like to think about it basically is imagine that I have an example of it, do I? No. I want you to think about the div like a glass, and our content is the text is like water. Okay? If you pour water into a glass, it fills it up, right? If you pour it right to the brim, you filled it with, in theory, the right amount. It's not too little, it's not too much. But if you keep pouring water, it eventually flows over the side. The container is not big enough to hold the amount of water, right? And that's what's happening here. Is, you know, we have this, we've set the dimensions of this div, we set it to 300, 300, but that's not big enough for the amount of text, okay? Going back to a program that, you know, a page layout program like Adobe InDesign, this can happen if you have more, if the text you have is too big for your frame. If you have something like this, you would see a little plus sign, and that would mean that you actually have more content than is visible because the frame is not big enough. And that's kind of what's happening here. So the default is that if your content is bigger than the container you've set up for it, it just kind of overflows. It has nowhere to go, so it just kind of overflows. We don't always necessarily like that. So to handle that, there is a CSS property called Overflow. So it handles what happens to that content that's going to be overflown. So instead of, what we're going to do is I'm going to use hidden. What hidden is going to do is it's going to hide all of the content that overflows. So visually that looks really good, you know, because we don't have this excess stuff spilling out. But from a functional standpoint, it's not very good. Because if you think about it, what's the point of an article? Well, the point of an article is to read it. But the problem is like, well, we've literally just kind of cut it off here. We've cut it off like in the middle of the article, so people aren't able to finish the article, right? That's no good. So what I would like to do is I still want to keep the size, but I still want people to be able to read the content. So there's another option called scroll. What that does is it's going to add scroll bars. This allows users to scroll up and down, so the dimensions are staying the same, but they can still read all of the content. Okay. Finally, you can just do what is called visible, which is typically the default in most browsers. Visible means that even though the content falls out, that you can still see it, which is typically the default. Okay, so try that out real quick. That was exercise 4 and 5, dealing with CSS height, width, and overflow.